A room built on power. The room carried a kind of polish that only money under pressure could buy. Crystal glasses caught low light, tables were spaced with intention, and every voice knew precisely how loud it was allowed to be. This was a place where fortunes relaxed beside threat, where smiles often arrived before trust and lingered long after sincerity had left. No signs announced who held power here because no signs were needed. Everyone understood the hierarchy by instinct, by posture, by which chairs were never empty and which doors were never questioned. Authority lived in glances, pauses, and the quiet way certain names were never spoken twice. Dean Martin was already part of that unspoken order, though he did nothing to claim it. He did not arrive with ceremony or command attention by force of personality. His presence settled rather than expanded, as if the room adjusted itself around him instead of the other way around. He spoke little, listened more, and carried himself with the ease of someone who had long since learned the difference between noise and weight. People noticed him not because he demanded notice, but because he never competed for it. In a room that measured worth by control, his restraint stood out quietly. Conversations bent slightly when he was near, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He represented continuity in a place built on leverage, a reminder that reputation could be earned without intimidation. Even those who prided themselves on dominance understood, instinctively, that his kind of authority could not be rushed or forced. The evening moved forward at its measured pace, glasses refilled, deals hinted at rather than stated. Laughter surfaced, then faded, always aware of who was listening. Nothing seemed urgent, yet everything felt conditional, as though one misplaced moment could tilt the balance of the entire room. It was within this fragile calm that expectations formed. Some men believed power meant permission, that money insulated words from consequence. Others watched more carefully, sensing that the night had not yet revealed its purpose. Dean remained still, patient, as though waiting for the room to show its true character. No one knew in that moment how quickly calm could harden into judgment. The air held its breath, balanced between civility and collapse. What followed would not arrive loudly, nor would it announce itself with spectacle. It would emerge the way real tests always do, quietly, when dignity is least prepared to defend itself. The room, unaware of what it was about to witness, continued as if nothing of consequence had begun, unaware that power was already being measured by a different standard than it had ever respected before. Reputation followed Dean Martin into rooms long before introductions were offered, yet it never arrived ahead of his character. The public knew him as composed, charming, effortlessly at ease, but those surfaces told only part of the story. What truly carried weight in volatile spaces was not the image, but the reliability beneath it. He was known for showing up the same way every time. No shifting moods, no sudden performances of dominance, no attempts to outshine the room. In environments where unpredictability was often mistaken for strength, that steadiness became its own form of authority. People trusted what did not change. Dean understood something many powerful men never learned. Fear creates distance, but consistency creates gravity. He never raised his voice to control a moment. He did not corner people into agreement or use silence as a threat. Instead, he listened, remembered details others dismissed, and treated even tense situations as if composure were the default setting. Loyalty mattered deeply to him, not as a public virtue, but as a private rule. He remembered favors long after others forgot them and protected people quietly, without requiring credit. That reputation traveled faster than rumors ever could. In places where alliances were fragile and respect could be rented, his was earned slowly and never for sale. Those who mistook his restraint for softness often corrected themselves over time. They noticed that conversations settled when he entered, that conflicts lost momentum in his presence. He did not neutralize rooms through force, but through a calm certainty that left little room for posturing. There were men who dominated through intimidation, whose authority depended on reminders of what they could take. Dean belonged to a different category. His influence came from what he would not do. He would not humiliate. He would not escalate. He would not trade dignity for leverage. That distinction mattered more than anyone admitted openly. In spaces defined by risk, people leaned toward what felt stable. Loud power demanded attention, but quiet power earned confidence. Dean offered the latter without ever labeling it as such. As the night continued, those contrasts remained subtle but present. The room held both kinds of authority within its walls, though only one of them would endure scrutiny. Dean remained unchanged, his posture relaxed, his manner unforced, unaware that his consistency was already preparing him for a moment that would test everything he stood for. The respect surrounding him did not announce itself, but it held, waiting patiently, ready to reveal its strength when noise finally failed. It was this unspoken reliability that separated him from the room's louder figures. While others measured influence by reaction, Dean measured it by absence of chaos. He believed control was proven by what never happened, by conflicts that dissolved before forming. That belief had guided him through years of unstable company, and it now rested quietly beneath the surface, steady and untested, as the evening continued toward a moment no one yet understood. The balance had not yet shifted. He did not announce himself when he entered, because he did not believe announcements were necessary. The room adjusted in small ways instead, chairs angled slightly, conversation softened, attention redistributed without instruction. His confidence did not arrive with aggression, but with assumption, the quiet belief that space belonged to him by default. The mob boss carried entitlement the way others carried coats, casually, without awareness of its weight. He spoke as though agreement were inevitable, and listened only long enough to confirm his own expectations. People around him laughed easily, not because the words were especially clever, but because laughter had become a reflex. He believed power was proven by comfort, by the ease with which boundaries could be tested and moved. Nothing in his manner suggested urgency or threat. He did not need to lean forward or lower his voice. Ownership in his mind had already been established. From where he sat, the room was an extension of himself, a place shaped by permission rather than respect. He assumed everyone understood the terms, that tolerance existed only because he allowed it. This belief was reinforced by years of unchallenged behavior, by environments where silence was bought and compliance disguised as loyalty. His attention eventually drifted toward Dean Martin, not with curiosity but with dismissal. Dean's calm registered not as confidence but as passivity. In a world where dominance was often loud, restraint looked unfamiliar, even suspicious. The mob boss mistook stillness for absence. Small signals revealed the imbalance forming. A lingering glance, a half-smile that assumed superiority, casual remarks that edged closer to presumption than conversation. Nothing overt, nothing that would draw objection yet, but enough to suggest a quiet miscalculation underway. He believed he understood the room completely. He believed everyone present operated by the same rules he did, measuring strength by how much one could impose without resistance. What he failed to recognize was that some authority does not reveal itself until it is challenged. Dean remained unchanged, neither engaging nor retreating, his demeanor steady, unreadable. That steadiness was interpreted as permission rather than restraint. The moment had not arrived yet, but its shape was becoming clearer. Somewhere between confidence and carelessness, a line was forming, invisible but firm. And as the evening continued, that line drew closer to being crossed, unnoticed by the one who assumed it did not exist at all. The remark arrived without ceremony, folded into conversation as though it were harmless. It was delivered casually, almost lazily, the way people speak when they believe the room belongs to them. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as if the words might dissolve into the air and be forgotten. They did not. The reference landed with a weight no one anticipated. It touched something private, something fixed beyond negotiation. Dean Martin's brother was not a story, not a memory to be borrowed for effect. He was absent and therefore untouchable. The moment the meaning settled, the atmosphere changed. No one reacted loudly. There were no gasps, no sharp intakes of breath. The response was quieter, more absolute. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the background music seemed suddenly intrusive, as though it had violated an unspoken rule. The stillness was not confusion, it was recognition. Everyone understood at once that a line had been crossed that could not be stepped back over. In rooms like this, insults were common currency, but family was different. The dead were different. What had been said could not be reframed as humor or brushed aside as excess. The man who made the remark did not immediately notice the change. He continued forward, expecting laughter or indulgence, unaware that the room had already withdrawn its permission. The ease he relied on faltered, if only slightly, as eyes avoided his and bodies shifted away. Dean did not move. His expression did not change, but the calm he carried took on a different density. It was no longer simply composure. It was containment. He absorbed the moment without reacting, allowing the weight of what had been said to settle fully into the space. The discomfort grew because no one rushed to relieve it. No one softened the moment. The silence lengthened, becoming a shared acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. The room understood it was now part of the moment, complicit by witness. What lingered was not shock but certainty. The kind that arrives when consequences are no longer hypothetical. Whatever followed would not be loud, but it would be permanent. The joke had failed, and in its failure, it revealed the fragile arrogance behind it. The night had shifted. There would be no return to ease, only the slow unfolding of what restraint would now demand. It was understood without explanation that memory had been mishandled. The offense was not volume but carelessness, not cruelty but entitlement. Those present felt the quiet shame of proximity, the awareness that dignity had been tested in their presence. No one moved to correct the mistake. Correction, they sensed, would not come from the crowd. It would come from the one person who had remained still long enough to let the truth of the moment expose itself. Patience now governed the room, replacing indulgence with consequence, and waiting assumed a sharper, unavoidable meaning tonight. Dean did not answer the remark. He did not shift in his chair or adjust his expression. If anything, his stillness deepened, as though the room had settled into him rather than pressing against him. The absence of reaction was immediate, deliberate, and unmistakable. Silence in that space was rarely accidental. It was usually filled quickly, smoothed over, replaced by jokes or distraction. This silence remained untouched. Dean allowed it to exist without interruption, giving it room to become what it already was. He neither rushed to defend nor signaled offense. He waited. His posture remained relaxed but not casual. There was no collapse in his frame, no tension in his shoulders. He did not look away, yet he did not stare. The restraint was precise, practiced, the kind that comes from understanding when movement weakens a moment rather than strengthens it. Those watching began to feel the difference. This was not hesitation, it was control. By refusing to react, Dean removed the possibility of escalation. There would be no raised voice to answer, no emotion to exploit. What remained was the raw fact of what had been said, exposed without commentary. The man who had spoken sensed the shift now. Without a response to measure himself against, he was left alone with his words. The silence offered no shelter, no laughter to hide behind. It became clear that nothing would rescue him from what he had introduced. Dean's calm did not invite sympathy, nor did it demand apology. It simply held. In that holding, the imbalance became unmistakable. One man had spoken carelessly. The other had chosen discipline. The contrast carried more force than confrontation ever could. Time stretched slightly, just enough for everyone present to understand what restraint looked like when practiced by someone who did not fear losing control. Dean was not yielding ground. He was defining it. The room adjusted again, subtly, this time toward him. What followed would come because of this pause, not despite it. The silence had done its work. It had clarified the moment, stripped it of noise, and prepared the ground for whatever truth would need to be spoken next. Nothing had happened yet, but everything had already changed. It was a mastery learned over years spent among unpredictable men, where restraint protected more than aggression ever could. Dean understood that immediate response often served the careless, not the careful. By waiting, he preserved dignity, memory, and proportion. The pause was not emptiness. It was intention, measured and controlled, creating space for consequence to emerge without force. In that quiet, authority reorganized itself, preparing the room for a reckoning that would not rely on volume or spectacle of dominance at all there. Dean had learned early that memory was not a public thing. It lived quietly, carried forward by loyalty rather than repetition, and protected by restraint. Family did not belong to rooms like this, no matter how powerful the men inside believed themselves to be. His brother existed for him beyond stories or reputation. He was a fixed presence, defined by shared history rather than explanation. The loss had never been converted into narrative currency. It remained private, handled with care, untouched by spectacle. That was why the remark mattered more than the man who made it. Words could bruise pride, but they could also trespass into spaces that did not offer forgiveness. The offense was not volume or cruelty, but carelessness toward something that could not answer back. Dean understood that grief did not announce itself. It waited, patient, asking only for respect. He had carried it long enough to know when it was being tested. Responding impulsively would have reduced it, turned memory into reaction. He refused that exchange. Around him, others sensed the depth they had overlooked. The silence was no longer just social tension. It carried weight because it guarded something human, something fragile beneath polished surfaces. The room felt suddenly smaller, less certain of its rules. Loyalty shaped Dean's restraint. He had never treated family as leverage, never allowed private bonds to become public tools. The discipline he practiced now was an extension of that loyalty. Protecting memory required limits, even when provoked. The man who spoke faded in importance. He became incidental to the moment. What mattered was the boundary he had crossed and the clarity it brought. Dean's focus was not on correction but preservation. He was choosing what would remain intact. This inward shift changed the energy of the night. Power no longer felt performative. It felt measured against something older and quieter. Those present understood that the cost of words was not always immediate, but it was always real. Dean remained composed, but the calm now carried gravity. The insult had revealed itself as small, unable to compete with the weight of loyalty and memory. Nothing outward needed to escalate. The truth had already settled, firm and unmoved, waiting for the moment when discipline would turn inward reflection back into action. He did not romanticize the past, nor did he weaponize it. Memory to him was a responsibility, something to be carried with steadiness rather than displayed for effect. In honoring it quietly, he protected more than himself. He protected the standard by which men were measured when no applause followed. That understanding settled over him now, firm and clear. The night demanded patience, not reaction, and he was willing to give it. What came next would emerge from this restraint, shaped by loyalty rather than impulse, and guided by a respect that did not need witnesses to remain intact. In that choice, the meaning of power narrowed, leaving only character, memory, and discipline to decide what deserved to endure beyond the night. When Dean finally spoke, it did not feel like an interruption. It felt like a conclusion arriving at the correct time. The room did not lean forward in anticipation, because anticipation would have suggested drama. What followed carried no performance in it at all. His voice was steady, neither softened nor sharpened by emotion. It carried the same measured tone he had used all evening, unchanged by provocation. That consistency was the first signal that this response was not reactive. It had been chosen. He did not raise the subject back into the air. He did not repeat the remark or acknowledge it as humor. Instead, he addressed the boundary that had been crossed, calmly and without flourish. The truth he offered did not accuse. It clarified. The words were simple, almost restrained to the point of austerity. They established what should have already been understood. Some things were not open for casual reference. Some lives were not material. Some losses were not invitations. His message did not demand agreement. It assumed it. What made the response final was not its firmness but its proportion. He did not inflate the moment. He did not seek validation from the room. He spoke as though the matter required no further explanation. In doing so, he removed the possibility of debate. The power dynamic shifted without announcement. The man who had spoken earlier found himself without footing, not because he had been challenged aggressively, but because his authority no longer applied. Dean's response had redrawn the rules of relevance. Control was no longer measured by permission, but by principle. The room followed instinctively. Attention moved away from noise and settled on clarity. No one interrupted. No one attempted to dilute the meaning. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer tense. It was resolved. Dean did not linger in the moment. He did not wait for acknowledgement or apology. His posture remained unchanged, his manner unhurried. The response had not cost him composure because it had not required escalation. What lingered instead was recognition. Those present understood they had witnessed something uncommon, authority exercised without spectacle, correction delivered without humiliation, strength expressed without dominance. The man who had assumed ownership of the room now occupied less space than before. His presence felt diminished, not by force but by comparison. He had spoken freely. Dean had spoken precisely. The difference was unmistakable. As conversation slowly resumed, it did so on altered terms. The room no longer belonged to entitlement. It belonged to restraint. Dean had not taken power. He had revealed where it already lived. That revelation carried forward quietly. People would remember this not as an argument, but as a lesson in proportion. The calm response had done what noise never could. It had closed the matter without closing the room. Dean returned to silence without ceremony, but the silence no longer weighed on him. It supported him. What needed to be said had been said, and nothing further could strengthen it. The moment was complete. The balance had shifted decisively, though no one would mark the exact second. That was the nature of real authority. It did not announce itself when it arrived. It simply remained, leaving everything else to adjust around it until the room understood who had spoken with truth and who had merely filled space. When the room began to move again, it did so without acknowledging him. Conversations resumed elsewhere, angled away, voices lowered not out of caution but indifference. The shift was subtle enough to be missed by anyone looking for confrontation, yet decisive enough to be felt by the man who had assumed command. He noticed it in the small delays, the absence of eye contact, the way responses arrived slower and thinner than before. Where laughter had once followed his remarks, there was now polite space. No one challenged him. No one needed to. Attention had simply migrated. Arrogance rarely collapses in dramatic fashion. More often, it is starved. What gave him presence had never been fear alone, but participation. The room had granted him relevance, and now it was withdrawing it quietly, as one might close a door without noise. He adjusted his posture, spoke again, tested the air. The reaction confirmed what he already sensed. His words no longer shaped the atmosphere. They landed, but they did not travel. Authority that depends on assumption cannot survive clarity. Dean did not watch this happen. He did not need to. The collapse was not his work but the room's response to proportion. Once restraint had been demonstrated, excess had nowhere to stand. The contrast did its work without instruction. Others followed the gravity of the moment naturally. Chairs turned. Conversations deepened elsewhere. The hierarchy reorganized itself around composure rather than entitlement. No signal was given, yet alignment occurred. The man who had spoken too freely now occupied a smaller version of himself. His presence felt compressed, defined by what it was no longer allowed to dominate. The confidence he carried began to look performative, dependent on reactions that no longer came. There were no threats, no raised voices, no consequences announced. The loss was social and therefore complete. Power that cannot command respect without force reveals its limits quickly once restraint enters the room. By the time he recognized what had happened, it was already finished. The space no longer belonged to him, and reclaiming it would have required something he could not provide. The night continued without him at its center. What remained was not humiliation but exposure. Arrogance had been measured against discipline and found excessive. The room settled into its new balance, calmer, quieter, and less impressed by noise. The collapse did not echo, it simply ended. It was a lesson absorbed rather than announced. Men who had relied on volume recalibrated, sensing that excess now carried risk instead of advantage. The evening's earlier tension dissolved into something more durable, a shared understanding that restraint had redrawn the boundaries of respect. No one spoke of it directly. They did not need to. The absence of spectacle preserved the meaning, ensuring it would travel quietly beyond the room, intact and unembellished. It lingered as a standard, influencing conduct long after departures, shaping memory, and confirming that authority survives best when it remains measured thereafter. What lingered after the evening progressed was not the remark itself, but the lesson it quietly delivered. The room had witnessed something few environments like it ever allowed to surface. Power had been tested without force, and it had not survived the comparison. Those present began to understand that strength was not proven by how easily someone could wound another. Cruelty, they realized, was a shortcut mistaken for authority, effective only when no alternative was offered. The moment restraint entered the room, cruelty lost its utility. Fear, too, revealed its limits. It could silence, but it could not command loyalty or confidence. The mob boss had relied on anticipation of reaction, on the assumption that others would adjust themselves around him. When that anticipation disappeared, fear dissolved into irrelevance. What replaced it was not defiance but clarity. People recognized that respect arrived when boundaries were honored, not violated. The room recalibrated around that recognition instinctively, without debate or instruction. Decency had not demanded attention, it had earned it. The realization carried weight because it unfolded collectively. No single person declared it aloud, yet everyone absorbed it. Authority, they saw, was sustained not by permission to offend, but by the discipline to refrain. Once that distinction was made visible, excess lost its legitimacy. Dean had not corrected the room. He had simply shown it a different measure. By remaining proportionate, he revealed how fragile dominance became when stripped of noise. Power collapsed quickly because it had been built on assumption rather than principle. As conversations resumed, they did so with a new awareness. Words were chosen more carefully. Jokes stayed within safer borders. The room behaved as though it had been reminded of an older code, one rarely spoken but deeply understood. What the room learned that night would not be recorded or retold loudly. It would surface later, in hesitation before speaking, in respect offered without calculation. The lesson endured because it was quiet. Strength, they realized, did not need witnesses. Respect did not require fear. And authority, once exposed to decency, either adapted or disappeared. The room had watched that process unfold in real time, and it would not forget how quickly arrogance unraveled when faced with calm restraint and moral clarity. It altered the way men regarded one another for the remainder of the night. Small courtesies returned. Interruptions softened. Even disagreement carried less edge. The environment adjusted because it had been shown that dignity could still govern behavior. No one applauded the change, but everyone felt it. The lesson settled into the room like a lowered voice, present, steady, and impossible to ignore. It remained there, shaping conduct long after departure, guiding restraint where impulse once ruled quietly. The lesson widened as the night wore on, extending beyond the individuals involved and settling into something older and more durable. Crossing sacred ground had always carried a cost, even in rooms where danger was familiar. Family, especially the dead, occupied a space that did not belong to performance or leverage. Those who understood this code rarely spoke of it. It existed as an inherited restraint, passed quietly through generations that knew survival depended on limits. The dead could not defend themselves, and so they were protected by custom. To violate that protection was to reveal a failure of judgment rather than strength. The remark had exposed that failure clearly. It showed how easily entitlement mistook access for permission. Invoking family in that way did not diminish its subject. It diminished the speaker, narrowing him to the moment he misunderstood. Dean's response had not needed explanation because the code was already known, even if it had been neglected. The room recognized it instantly, as one recognizes a forgotten rule the moment it is broken. Respect returned not because it was demanded, but because it had been reminded. In earlier eras, even dangerous spaces observed these boundaries. Men who lived by risk still understood restraint. They knew that some lines preserved order, not sentiment. Family memory was one of them. When those lines held, conflict remained contained. What had changed over time was not the rule, but the willingness to ignore it. Power had begun to confuse reach with right. The night corrected that confusion quietly. The cost of crossing sacred ground was not retaliation, it was exposure. Those present saw that cruelty toward the defenseless did not elevate authority, it stripped it. The dead did not need protection through force. They were protected by proportion and by the collective refusal to allow their names to be used cheaply. This understanding restored balance. It reminded the room that respect was not sentimental but structural. Without it, power became reckless and short-lived. With it, even tense environments retained order. The lesson did not accuse. It clarified. Crossing sacred ground revealed character more accurately than any boast. The room absorbed that truth and carried it forward, recognizing that dignity endured longest when limits were honored, especially where danger once made restraint essential. It reminded everyone that memory functioned as a boundary, not an ornament, and that the past demanded care rather than convenience. In honoring those limits, men once preserved stability where chaos threatened constantly. The night echoed that older discipline, suggesting that order survives not through fear, but through shared restraint, carried quietly and enforced by collective recognition rather than force. That recognition lingered, shaping conduct long after the room finally emptied. Dean did not announce his departure. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and moved toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The room acknowledged the moment without ceremony. His departure carried no challenge, no defiance, and no demand for attention. It was calm, unremarkable, and therefore complete. Dean left behind a space that had already adjusted itself. Conversations continued, but their tone had changed. People noticed his absence more than they had noticed his presence. That imbalance spoke quietly but clearly. There was no victory claimed, no humiliation delivered. Authority does not require a closing statement. It reveals itself in what remains after someone leaves. Dean's calm exit left proportion intact. The room did not rush to fill the space he vacated. It allowed the meaning to settle. Those who remained understood that nothing more was required. The absence of spectacle preserved the lesson. No raised voices followed. No explanations were offered. The night concluded without punctuation. Dean's departure closed the matter because it refused to extend it. That restraint was the final statement. Those who witnessed it would remember the quiet more than the words. In leaving without display, Dean confirmed what the night had already taught. Power does not linger through force. It endures through restraint. The room remained behind him, quieter, steadier, and more honest. His exit required no witness to succeed. It simply held. What endured was not memory of conflict, but recognition of measure. Men recalibrated their behavior without being told. Restraint had been modeled, and it carried forward. Dean's withdrawal reminded the room that authority survives distance. It does not need proximity to assert itself. By leaving calmly, he allowed the lesson to remain uncontested. Nothing chased him and nothing followed. The room absorbed the meaning in silence. When people eventually departed, they carried that standard with them. It would surface later in hesitation and restraint. Dean's exit did not end the night, it clarified it. What followed was order, not noise. The quiet departure stood as the final proof. Authority, when real, does not linger to be admired. It leaves, knowing the room has already changed. Dean stepped into the night without looking back, and nothing needed revision. The meaning remained intact, steady, and unchallenged after he was gone. That was the sound authority makes when it is complete. It says nothing, and yet it endures, long after that night. What remained after the night was not a story meant for repetition, but a standard meant for remembering. Nothing about what had happened required embellishment. Its strength lived in proportion, in the way dignity held its ground without asking to be acknowledged. Power that must announce itself is always uncertain. It depends on reaction, on fear, on constant reinforcement. What endured here was different. It required no reminders, no witnesses, no confirmation. It existed because it was consistent, because it aligned action with principle without urgency. The contrast lingered quietly. Intimidation had appeared large, but it proved temporary. Dignity had appeared modest, but it reshaped the room. That reversal carried a truth older than the setting that revealed it. Real authority does not argue for space. It creates it. Those who reflected on the night would not recall raised voices or dramatic gestures. They would remember restraint. They would remember how silence clarified rather than concealed. They would remember that character revealed itself most clearly when provocation failed to produce spectacle. The lesson extended beyond the individuals involved. It reached into a larger understanding of strength, one rooted in limits rather than excess. Respect, it reminded, is not something taken. It is something maintained through discipline. Everyone carries moments where reaction feels justified, even deserved. The night offered an alternative measure. It suggested that restraint is not weakness, and that composure is not surrender. It demonstrated that dignity, once chosen, cannot be taken away by carelessness. The audience is left not with instruction but with recognition, the kind that invites quiet comparison. What forms of strength do we trust most? Which endure without needing defense? Which leave rooms changed long after departure? Power that doesn't need to prove itself does not seek the last word. It allows meaning to settle and move forward on its own. That is why it lasts. It does not rely on memory being repeated. It relies on conduct being consistent. The night ended without resolution because it did not need one. The balance had already been restored. What mattered remained intact. Dignity had outlived intimidation, as it always does, quietly, steadily, without ever raising its voice.